to get us started, we are on Psalm 65, I believe. The two people that keep up with that for me, neither one of them are here this morning, but I believe we did Psalm 64 last week, so at least according to my records, and so we'll begin this morning with Psalm 65. Praise is due to you, O God, in Zion, and to you shall vows be performed. O you who answer prayer, to you all flesh shall come. When deeds of iniquity overwhelm us, you forgive our transgressions. Happy are those whom you choose and bring near to live in your courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, your holy temple. By awesome deeds you answer us with deliverance, O God of our salvation. You are the hope of the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas. By your strength you establish the mountains. You are girded with might. You silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of the waves, the tumult of the peoples. Those who live at earth's farthest bounds are awed by your signs. You make the gateways of the morning and the evening shout for joy. You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water. You provide the people with grain, for so you have prepared it. You water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening it with showers, and blessing its growth. You crown the year with your bounty. Your wagon tracks overflow with richness. The pastures of the wilderness overflow. The hills gird themselves with joy. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy. Lord, we pray your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your word together. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going to be in Genesis chapter 3 this morning. Last week we talked about, we were Genesis adjacent last week. Since I was out of town for most of the week, I wasn't quite ready to enter into Genesis chapter 3 just yet. And so what we did was we traced some of the, hey Tay, we need to get the announcements on. We traced the theme of Genesis 1 and 2 through the Gospel of John. So we talked about how John has these stories in Genesis 1 and 2 as the background to his presentation of Jesus. And specifically, we focused on the prologue of the Gospel of John that kind of sets the stage. And then John's discussion of the end of Jesus' ministry. So Jesus' farewell discourse. So in John 15, 16, 17, Jesus has a whole bunch of teaching to the disciples before he dies. And in that teaching, we see some of these themes of Genesis 1 and 2 as well. And then in the resurrection account, we get a presentation of Jesus with the themes of Genesis 1 and 2 in the background as well. So this morning we're going to enter into the first portion of Genesis chapter 3, where we begin what we typically call the fall, which is interesting language that we call it the fall. My Bible has the heading, the first sin. We're going to talk about that. That's interesting language of calling it the fall or sin, because neither one of those words actually shows up in the text of Genesis 3. It's not described as humanity falling. It's not even described as humanity sinning in Genesis 3. It's humanity's eyes being opened which is a very, very interesting way to talk about Adam and Eve eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the way that it's described and the way some other things are talked about in Genesis 3 leave us with a bunch of questions that are unanswered. And I want to make sure to create, as we talk through it, some of that tension of the questions that are unanswered. In the end, we understand a lot of these things. We understand that what happens in Genesis chapter 3 is sin, that sin spreads throughout humanity. Paul, for example, in Romans chapter 5, talks about that. But in just the story world of Genesis 3, a lot of those questions are left unanswered. So there's some tension in this story that is filled out through the rest of the Bible, yes, but not actually in Genesis chapter 3. And I think that's an important distinction to make. A lot of the ways we think about the story in Genesis 3 is based on other texts, but not actually the text of Genesis 3. So as we talk about it, I want to give some nod to some other texts in the Old and the New Testament that help to fill out some of the questions that are left unaddressed. But ultimately, I want us to try as best as we can to stay within this narrative story world of Genesis 3 and just kind of dwell with some of the tension of these unanswered questions, because that's what I think the intention of the story was. You think about Genesis 3 originally being written a long, long time before Paul ever talked about sin and Adam and all of that. They didn't have the ability to turn to Romans and get a fuller picture theologically of what's going on here. All right, so Genesis 3 opens up in this way. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. When we get into Genesis chapter 3, we are introduced to one of the creatures that God has created. Right? In both Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, we get in both creation accounts a reference to God's creation of the animal world. In Genesis chapter 2, Adam names the animals. And so we could presume that this serpent is not only are we introduced to one of these animals that God has created, but one of the animals that Adam has named. So Adam has some kind of relationship with the serpent or serpents in general. This kind of animal doesn't seem to be anything that the man and the woman aren't familiar with. But we're told that the serpent is more crafty or cunning or clever than any other animal that God has made. So, I don't know if you've ever wondered why the tempter in Genesis 3 is a snake and not some other kind of animal. And maybe you haven't. It seems to me that over thousands of years of history where this story has had a great deal of influence, we just kind of, by the time we get to 2024, just kind of associate the idea of snake or serpent with deceit, craftiness, cunning, sin, because we're so familiar with this story. What's interesting is if you jump back to the world of ancient Israel and you read through the Old Testament, you'll find that this is really the only place that a serpent is connected with these things of being cunning and deceitful and clever and crafty. Normally, there are some other animals in different places in the Psalms and in the Proverbs and in the prophets that are used to illustrate these kinds of things. But serpent is kind of unique to Genesis chapter 3, though in our minds it makes sense because we're part of thousands of years of history that have been influenced by this story.
In the wilderness, when the children of Israel were wandering, wasn't there a serpent that he put up on the pole for people to look at?
Yes, so the people sinned. God sent poisonous snakes upon them, right? And Moses raises up a bronze serpent in the wilderness that anyone looks upon, they'll be saved from they're bitten by a snake. They look at it, they're healed. Jesus then in John 3 refers back to that and talks about himself being raised up for saving purposes.
Is there any other instances that you remember?
So one of the reasons that I think the serpent is used, and we see some examples of this, not in connection with being crafty or cunning or clever or sneaky or something like that, but Leviathan. When we're most familiar with that term from the book of Job. In Job, we have these two animals that are mentioned, the behemoth and the Leviathan. Some people think that what's being talked about in Job there are dinosaurs. I can assure you they are not dinosaurs. The Leviathan was a mythical creature that existed not just in the minds of Israel, but it existed within most of the cultures in the world at that point in time. So these cultures had shared beliefs in, not that this creature was necessarily real. Maybe they thought it was real at one point in time, maybe they didn't. That doesn't really matter. But they all had beliefs in this mythical creature that was called Leviathan. Leviathan was a sea monster that was typically depicted as a serpent. Not always, but typically depicted as a serpent, but dwelled in the sea. So you might think of like the Loch Ness monster, right? When you see pictures depicted of a Loch Ness monster, it's typically serpent-y-like in the sea. That's what Leviathan was. And in a lot of other cultures, Leviathan was a creature that had to be defeated before the gods could begin to create. So in some mythologies of other groups during this time, perhaps the god had to defeat this sea monster, and then from the remains and the blood of this sea monster, they use that to then create the rest of the universe. We get that or similar things in other cultures. Now what's interesting is when you turn to the Old Testament, the Old Testament gives some nods towards these other beliefs without accepting them and actually going in a different direction. So Genesis is an example of that. Genesis 1 begins with the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the water. So you have what's called primordial water, so water before anything was created, which was the case in a lot of other creation myths. But there is no Leviathan. Right? There's no sea monster, there's no battle of the gods, none of that happens. God just speaks and order comes to the creation. So you kind of get a nod towards this, but the Bible goes in a different direction. What Job's doing, for example, is he's saying that God created the Leviathan. So whether or not Job or the author believed that Leviathan was an actual creature then or any time in the past is irrelevant. Job's point is, you imagine the largest, scariest creature that you can, Leviathan would come to your mind, and he's like, even God created that. That's the point in Job. We see some references to Leviathan in the Psalms as well. And there, sometimes God is defeating Leviathan like the other gods. And the point is that we're showing the power and the sovereignty of God. In those cases, this is a fun fact. This is free, by the way. In the Psalms, some of the Psalms, we are pretty certain, can't be 100% certain, but we're pretty certain that there were some Psalms that were originally songs to other gods that then get taken by Israel and the name of the other god changed to Yahweh. So for example, Baal, we're going to talk about that in the Baal this morning. Here's another fun fact for you. Technically, The name Baal is pronounced Baal, not Baal, but in 21st century America, you just sound stupid if you say Baal, so we're going to call it Baal. But Baal was a storm deity. And so, for example, we have some psalms that talk about God in connection with water and storms as if he was a storm deity. Like you read them and it reads like God is the storm God. And we're pretty certain that those psalms were originally songs to Baal. The name Baal gets changed to Yahweh. Israel liked doing some of those things. So you have some psalms of Leviathan being destroyed that might have been songs talking about other gods in the context of some of these other mythologies.
What was the myth?
So the myth was different for different cultures. So like I said, sometimes the myth was, a lot of the times it was regarding creation. So there was this creature that was there from the beginning that had to be conquered or destroyed in order for the gods to begin to create. So the gods wanted to create, but there's this creature that's preventing them, and so they have to go to war with this creature. That's typically the way that the myths work, and so within that context you might get songs to these deities, like praising them for being able to destroy this creature. And so perhaps the names of those deities, whoever they might have been, get changed to Yahweh. It's like, no, Yahweh's the God that has the power and the strength and the ability to defeat even the strongest creature that you could ever imagine. So you think in a context like that, where you've got this powerful serpent that's used in a variety of different for a variety of different reasons, it's hard for me to imagine that that's not sitting in the background in some form or fashion in their understanding of this serpent in the garden, right? Because while there's not a connection with the themes of craftiness and cunningness and cleverness, there is a connection with evil and power and something that is anti-God. So if you think of Leviathan in creation, the gods have to overcome the being. So it's the gods on one side and the serpent on the other. That's the presentation that we get in Genesis 3 as well, is you've got God in his creation on one side and the serpent stands opposed to that. So that's likely some of the background. So you're talking about Old Testament imagery. There's not really Old Testament imagery that connects serpent to this description of being crafty, but there is to the idea of a serpent as this powerful creature or this creature that stands opposed to the work, particularly the creative work of God, or in other civilizations, the gods. And so that likely stands behind
I
this.
wondered what he looked like before God made him crawl on his belly.
Yeah, so we get that's we think of this serpent that has legs. We think of this serpent that's talking as well, which is interesting because it doesn't seem to bother the woman. The serpent just comes up and starts talking to her, and she starts talking back, which is one of those things that's not quite answered, right? Like what it's just kind of almost like a normal day, it seems like, when they begin to have this conversation. Now, it doesn't end like a normal day, but it seems almost like it begins just like a normal day in the garden, the snake and the woman having a conversation. The other reason that I think a serpent is used is because of the way a snake operates. So you think about an ancient Israelite, or even today, you look at a snake slithering on the ground, and you think of a snake as a slithery, slimy type of creature. Those are the terms that even today we use for someone that might be clever and deceitful, right? We might even call them a snake. Jesus calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers, so he calls them snakes. That seems to be connected with just our perception of the way that a snake operates. Like you just look at a snake moving and we tend to connect it with these human attributes. And I think that's the second part of it. So they kind of have this concept of Leviathan opposed to God, creation. They've also, snake gets kind of connected with some of these human attributes even to today. And so it would make sense to them that you have this serpent in the garden standing opposed to God's creation, acting in a crafty, cunning, clever kind of way. And you add to that, snakes are dangerous, or at least some snakes are dangerous. So, the story you mentioned of Israel in the wilderness is a prime example of snakes can be dangerous.
Snakes also hide. Like if you're doing your work and you got a lot of brush or something, they will blend into their surroundings and everything.
Yeah, so a snake is dangerous in a way that is different than most other animals, right? So you think of a lion is dangerous, but in a different way. A lion is this big, massive creature that's typically hard to miss, that is dangerous in that way. Snakes are dangerous in, again, we think of this word crafty, they're dangerous in a crafty way, a cunning way, a clever way, because they're able to hide, they're able to blend into their surroundings. I think of Israel in a desert, and snakes that are actually able to move the sand around to hide beneath the sand, so that when something comes by, they're underneath the sand and able to pop out of the sand. So you think of all of these images that an ancient Israelite must associate with a snake, and this story makes sense, right? Why it's a serpent that is doing all of these things. And I say that to say the function of the serpent, and I said this for our discussion of Genesis as well, the function of the serpent is primarily theological. Right? So you think of all of these themes that we just talked about that an Israelite would associate with the serpent. And those are things that become theological when they're applied to this serpent. Because this serpent is functioning theologically in all of those ways. It's being very deceitful. It's being very cunning. It's standing opposed to God's creation. And that's the role that it is filling in this story. One more thing I want to say about the serpent, and then we'll have spent 30 minutes talking about a snake. This serpent, we typically associate the serpent with Satan, right? The serpent is not ever identified as Satan. There's one possible exception to that. But you'll notice in this story, the serpent is just serpent. I could go into a long explanation of this next point. I won't, because I would probably put you to sleep. If it's interesting when you actually wrote a paper on this point that you're welcome to read if you are having trouble sleeping. It'll take the place of melatonin. But I wrote a paper on the development of this term, Satan. So in Hebrew, it's the word Satan. In Hebrew, in Hebrew, it's Satan. In the Greek New Testament, it's Satanas, which is actually an adjective, not a noun in the New Testament, which is an interesting point. The word Satan in the Old Testament functions as it's an adjective as well, so it functions as a descriptor, and then it moves into functioning as a position or a title, so it means something like accuser or opposer. For example, it's used of God's angel in the Balaam story. So the angel stands in the way of Balaam and his donkey, and the angel is a Satan. It's standing opposed to Balaam. God is called Satan in Chronicles because when he stands opposed to David. In Job, this being in God's heavenly court is called a Satan because it stands opposed to Job. In Ezekiel, An angel, again, is called a Satan because it's standing in the role of a prosecuting attorney. So there's this court scene in heaven, and you've got angels that are functioning as attorneys on both sides, and the prosecuting attorney gets called a Satan because the prosecuting attorney's job is to accuse the other side, and that's the role. It's not until the intertestamental period that this word ever gets used as a name to refer to a being, and that gets carried over into the New Testament. I say all that to say, even if this serpent is Satan, the ancient Israelites had no concept of Satan, of this evil being. That's something that develops later in Judaism. Ancient Israelites didn't even really have much of a concept of the separation between good and evil. You see that when you read the Old Testament. Everything good and evil flows from God. And it's later on that Jews develop and learn a deeper understanding of the spiritual realm. The reason for that is just because, we've talked about this before, God doesn't dump all the information about everything on humanity at one time. He allows us to discover things over time. So Israel had to discover and learn over time some of the more complicated nature of spiritual realm related things that then appear in the New Testament. So when we look at this serpent as Satan, again in the context of Genesis 3, never called Satan, what we're doing is we're reading this New Testament concept of this evil being called Satan back into Genesis 3, a concept that was not present when Genesis 3 was written, but a later development within Judaism. The one exception, sometimes we identify the serpent in Genesis 3 as Satan because of a reference in Revelation so you've got Satan / the dragon that is referred to the ancient serpent of old. That's a possibility that John is referring to this serpent in Genesis 3. My opinion, which may not be worth very much, is that I don't think that's what John is talking about. I think John's doing two other things. First, Satan in Revelation is described as a dragon, which would have been understood as a type of serpent. So he's sticking with, it's more dragon imagery there than Genesis 3 serpent imagery. And John's descriptions there, what seems to sit behind this description of Satan as a serpent or as a dragon, I think is built more on Leviathan language than Genesis 3 language, when you look at the context as a whole. But for the sake of our discussion, none of that matters a whole lot because the serpent's never called Satan in Genesis 3, which leaves us to wonder, then again, why the serpent is doing this, right? Like where is this temptation coming from? Because Genesis 3 doesn't answer the question. In the context of Genesis, we might assume it's some kind of evil spiritual being because they show up as early as Genesis chapter 6. But we're kind of left to wonder, again, I'd like to say this, you imagine you're reading this story for the first time. Who is this serpent? What are they doing? Why are they? The imagery makes sense, but what exactly is going on, we don't know. We're just introduced to this creature that humanity is meant to rule over. So you remember their job as being created in the image of God in Genesis 1. They're to have dominion over the creation. So they're to rule over this serpent. And what ends up happening is the serpent rules over them. So you get a reversal of God's intended roles in the creation. Human beings were meant to rule over the creation, and the creation ends up ruling over human beings, and it leads to a lot of problems. All right, I've talked way too much about a snake. Does anybody have any questions, comments that we want to add to our snake discussion?
When was Genesis written compared to Job?
That is a phenomenal question that I have no answer to. I will say this. these accounts in both oral tradition and written tradition get codified. That is, that like their final form. So like stories can shift a little bit over time. They get in their final form during the Persian period, for the most part. Job's an interesting case because we assume that Job lived during the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the long-time assumption. And the reason was because God has this direct relationship with Job. There's no temple, there's no tabernacle, there's no nothing. Like God had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we assume it's during that period. We can't assume that because Job's not an Israelite. So there would have been no expectation of temple, tabernacle, anything. He lives outside of the land of Israel. So the story of Job could have taken place at any time, which is not very helpful towards your question. This we do know. Job is written both in, there's parts of it, most of it's written in Hebrew. There are some Aramaic phrases in Job. Aramaic was a later development in the Hebrew language. So Aramaic developed late, and it becomes the primary language of Jews by the time we get to the time of Jesus. Most Jews in the first century spoke Aramaic. They no longer could speak or read or write in Hebrew. Well, most people couldn't read or write anyway, so that's not important. Most people spoke Aramaic and could no longer speak Hebrew, which was kind of the native language of the Jews. Aramaic is a Semitic language, so it's connected to Hebrew, but it is a different language that develops later. I say that to say Job was written, or at least edited into the final form that we have it now, at a late date. That's the only way that you get the Aramaic phrases in there. That's a long answer of saying I have absolutely no idea when Job was written. The only thing we could really say is that it at least came into its form later. The poetry in Job seems to be older than the introduction and the prologue. What likely happened was you had this poetry that was handed down in oral tradition because it was easier to memorize poetry than it is to memorize narrative. And at some point in time, these narrative portions at the beginning and the end get tacked on to explain the context of the poetry that takes up the majority of the book of Job. Interestingly enough, most of us don't know the poetry. We're familiar with the beginning of the story and the end of the story, and we skip the 50 chapters in the middle or something like that. It does get a little bit repetitive.
Job is assumed to be the oldest writing, is that correct?
It was assumed to be the oldest writing when it was assumed that Job was part of the patriarchal period. And if we reject that as the case, or the certain case, if we say we don't know, that opens it up now to Job being a very early writing, so very old, or a very late writing. I tend to think, my personal opinion, again, for whatever it might be worth, I kind of take a balanced opinion. I think that the poetic sections may be decently old. I think the narrative and the final structure of the book is relatively late because we get some of it put into Aramaic, which wouldn't have existed had it been written very, very early. Though that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been written very early and then some of these Aramaic things get added in later on. That's also a possibility. At the end of the day, God had a role in that process, though I don't know what the process is. So maybe around the time of Genesis, maybe after. this I think I can say with certainty. The part about what's translated Satan in our Bibles, which is a bad translation, but that section is late. Pretty late. I'm fairly certain about that. It's about the only thing I'm certain about when it comes to dating, which is notoriously difficult. Yes?
On a completely different note, you're talking about the creature, the serpent creature. And Mom asked about his appearance. And I think about the Komodo dragon, which is a large reptile creature that walks on 4 legs and has a tongue that looks like a snake's tongue. And so, I mean, I don't know if it was something like that, but I think it's interesting that possibly it could have stood up on his hind legs and walked around and went back down. Regardless, Satan, whatever that is, or there was a spiritual being that possessed him, or that took his shape, or whatever, or something else that happened. There was a curse in the end out there.
Yes, and to real briefly plug my podcast, we're doing a series on the unseen realm. So we're talking about all this spiritual stuff. We talk about the serpent. We talk about other spiritual beings. We're gearing up to talk about Satan and demons and stuff as we see them in the New Testament, to try to give a more fuller picture of maybe some of the things that might be going on here, because our tendency is to look at these beings in the New Testament and read them back into the Old Testament, which is problematic because they're two very different understandings of the way that the world. Not that that's completely off limits, but it's kind of a dangerous thing to do, because like you said, what we have here is a being that's standing opposed to God's intention. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's an interesting thing to think about, right? And unfortunately, what we have to do a lot of the times is unlearn what this being is and just kind of dwell in a place where I don't know, but I know what it's doing. I know the way that it's functioning. You see here, so the serpent's described as crafty, and he said to the woman, the second half of verse 3, did God say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. The serpent comes to the woman and says, did God say? Did he really say, you shall not eat from the tree you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? And the woman responds that God said we can eat of any tree, but there's one tree in the middle of the garden that we cannot eat from, and we cannot even touch, or we will die. So there's some interesting things that are going on here that are never explained. The serpent comes to the woman, and the woman knows what God said. God said we can eat of any tree in the garden, but there's this one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, going back to Genesis chapter 2, of that tree we cannot eat. Which is interesting, because you go back to the narrative in Genesis chapter 2, and the woman wasn't yet created when God gave that command. He tells the man, there's these two trees, the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God says you can eat of any tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you cannot eat. And so we're left to wonder, how does the woman know God's command? Did God instruct her later on? Did Adam instruct her? We don't know. What's interesting, though, is that the serpent's the one who actually quotes God's command from Genesis chapter 2. The woman gets it wrong. And it's interesting how she gets it wrong. So we have the addition of, not only can we not eat the tree, but we can't even touch it. God never said that. So we're kind of left to wonder, how does this addition to the command get there? Is this something that God adds later? You shall not even touch the tree. Maybe this is a rule that Adam and Eve made among themselves, right? Well, if we can't eat of this tree, we don't even want to get close enough to touch it, lest we be tempted to eat of the tree. Maybe that's where we can't even touch of the tree comes from. She says that this tree, to me this is interesting. She says that the tree that they can't eat from is the tree in the middle of the garden. She doesn't call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is what it's identified as in Genesis 2. She says there's this tree in the middle of the garden that we cannot eat. If you go back to Genesis 2, the tree of life is said to be in the midst or in the middle of the garden. We're never told where the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is. Which is interesting, because you could argue that maybe Eve got the trees confused. Because she uses the description of the tree that they cannot eat that's used to describe the tree of life, not of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Which is, it's just kind of interesting. It's some questions that are left unanswered, because the serpent knows what God says. He's the one that quotes God. The woman generally knows, but she gets a lot of things wrong, and we're wondering, where does this information come from? And I say all that to say, as we move through this story, sometimes we're very harsh on Adam and Eve, maybe rightly so, because now we're in the predicament that we're currently in. But when you dive into some of these discrepancies, it's possible to have a bit more benevolent reading of the text. That is, you could argue from the point of view of maybe they are confused. Imagine if all the trees looked the same and God was like, well, this is the one that you can't eat from. Maybe they got confused about what tree was which. There's all kinds of interesting things that go on in her response. We're also left to wonder, this is dramatically unimportant, but what kind of tree was it? Was it an apple tree? Was it an orange tree? Later Jews believed it was a fig tree, because they sowed fig leaves to cover themselves. And later Jews believed that the fig leaves were taken from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So after they ate of the tree and realized that they were naked, they take leaves off of the tree that they just ate from. There's a little bit of irony there. At the end of the day, we don't know what tree it was. I personally like that Jewish interpretation of the fig tree, because I think it is a little bit ironic. But the point that I want to make with that is that the language that the woman uses is interesting. It leaves us with some more questions that are unanswered, and it opens at least the possibility that this wasn't just a blatant, well, I know for sure what God said, and I'm for sure going to do something different. But you have the possibility of maybe some confusion that they have on what God has said, but definitely the serpent, and maybe they were confused, and the serpent taps into that, right? Because the serpent continues to kind of confuse. Well, did God really say? Are you really actually going to die? The serpent suggests the idea, well, maybe God just doesn't want you to eat from it because God doesn't want you to become like him, which is true, right? They eat of the tree of knowledge. They're kicked out of the garden, so they don't eat of the tree of life. Quote, God says, lest they become like one of us. That's the interesting thing. We'll talk about this more next week. With the serpent never lies. He says they're not going to die as soon as they eat of it, and they don't, though God had said that. God does fear them becoming like him, because God says that. The serpent never actually does something false, nor does the serpent ever actually tempt them. He doesn't say, well, why don't you eat from this tree? He lets Adam and Eve make the decision. He kind of plants these seeds of doubt, these seeds of confusion. Perhaps they were already a bit confused, and he just like blows this up and then leaves and lets them do with the information what they will. And they end up choosing to eat of the tree, which is, I don't know, at least in the way that I grew up, is a little bit different way of thinking about the story. I always thought about the story of, well, they just blatantly went against God because they were tempted to do so. And the text actually is a little bit more nuanced than that way of thinking about it. But I'm 2 minutes over, which is probably no surprise to you. I'm going to stop there. We will pick up in Genesis 3, hopefully get through more than like one verse next week. Then I believe it's the following week is a fifth Sunday, and so I won't be here. So we'll have one more week in Genesis 3, and then I'll be gone, and then we'll be back. Genesis 3.